Priscilla Presley was 75, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't defending anyone. Not Elvis, not herself. Just the truth. She said she hadn't planned to talk about it that day. The interviewer had asked a simple question, one she'd answered 1,000 times before. What was Elvis really like behind closed doors? Usually she'd smile, glide through the same polished answers, talk about charm, charisma, tenderness, the safe memories. But something shifted in her eyes. Maybe it was age, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe she finally realized that the world would never understand Elvis unless they knew the part he kept buried, even from her. She leaned forward, fingers tracing the edge of a coffee cup. "I think people forget he was human," she whispered. "They talk about his voice, his fame, his girls, but they don't talk about what it did to him or to us." For a moment, she went silent. The air itself seemed to listen. And then she said something she'd never said before. "He wasn't who you think he was, not with me, not with anyone." That one sentence hung there like thunder before a storm. She remembered the first time she saw him vulnerable. Not the star, not the king, just Elvis, the man who couldn't sleep. It was 1962. She'd flown in from Germany to spend a few days in Memphis. He'd just come home from a movie set, packing the floor, half singing, half muttering to himself. She thought he was rehearsing lines, but when she stepped closer, she heard him say something that chilled her. "I don't know who I am when they stop looking." Back then, she didn't understand. How could she? She was 17, still writing letters to her mother, still blushing when he called her little one. She thought love meant being there when he needed her. But Elvis didn't need someone to love him. He needed someone to keep him from disappearing. That night she tried to hold him, and he just stared at the ceiling. "He used to talk to the dark," she said softly, like it was the only thing that answered back. She paused. It started long before the drugs, before the fame got too loud. That loneliness was there from the beginning. It was the part nobody ever wanted to see. The interviewer shifted, unsure whether to speak. But Priscilla wasn't looking at him anymore. She was somewhere else, back in that big, echoing house with the velvet curtains and endless nights. She said the nights at Graceland were never quiet. Laughter, music, phones ringing, the Memphis Mafia moving through the halls like ghosts. But behind every noise, she could feel his restlessness growing. Elvis didn't rest. He escaped. Into songs, into strangers, into anything that made him forget how trapped he felt in his own legend. He was surrounded by people who adored him, she said, but none of them really saw him. "I think he stopped believing anyone could." Her voice trembled, not with bitterness, but with something that sounded closer to regret. "I loved him," she said, "but I didn't understand him. I don't think anyone did. He wanted to be free and needed to be worshipped at the same time. That's not something you can fix. That's something you endure." The interviewer asked quietly, "Do you think he loved you?" She smiled, sad, almost tender. "I never doubted that, not once, but love wasn't simple with Elvis. It was layered. He loved with guilt. He loved with fear. He could make you feel like the only woman in the world and then vanish into himself." Her gaze lifted slightly. "People think I stayed because I wanted the lifestyle, the fame, but that house, it wasn't gold, it was glass, every crack showed." She remembered the first argument they ever had. Not the one the tabloids wrote about. This was before all that. He had promised to call her from Los Angeles, and when he didn't, she spent 2 days waiting by the phone. When he finally returned, she tried to sound casual, tried to hide the hurt. He looked at her with those blue eyes and said, "Don't ever doubt me, Scylla. When I'm out there, I'm just trying to survive it." She nodded back then, not knowing what he meant. Now she said quietly, "I know exactly what he meant." There were times, she admitted, when she wondered whether she had met the real Elvis at all, or just the one he wanted her to see. He could be so gentle, so boyish. He'd write her notes, draw little hearts, call her from hotels just to ask if she missed him. And then, without warning, he'd shut down completely. No eye contact, no words, just that thousand-yard stare, like he'd left the room even when he was sitting right beside her. That was the Elvis I couldn't reach, she said, and that's the one who haunted me. Every time he went on tour, she'd tell herself it would be different this time. That he'd come back lighter. But he always came back more tired, more distant. Some nights he'd hold me and I'd think maybe he's finding his way back. And then by morning he was gone again, physically there, but miles away. The interviewer asked if she had ever felt angry. She thought about that for a long moment. Anger comes easy when you feel invisible, she said, but when you love someone like Elvis, anger doesn't last. You start to replace it with understanding, and that's dangerous because you start excusing everything, every silence, every lie. She hesitated, her hands tightening around the cup. I used to believe he was protecting me from his world. Now I think he was protecting himself from mine. She told a story then, a story she said she'd never shared before. One night in 1963, after a long silence, he called her at 3 in the morning. She thought something terrible had happened. Instead, he said quietly, "Scylla, I had a dream I couldn't wake up from. I was on stage, but no one could see me. I kept singing, but they just walked away." She tried to comfort him, told him he was loved, told him the world adored him. He only whispered, "That's what scares me. When they stop, who'll I be?" She said that question followed her for decades. Even after he was gone, she could still hear it. And now, at 75, she finally had an answer. He never stopped being Elvis, he just stopped believing it meant something. For a few seconds, the room was completely still. The ticking clock became louder than the recording equipment. She took a slow breath and looked straight ahead. "They think I'm telling this to clear my name," she said, "but this isn't about me. This is about the man I watched lose himself piece by piece because the world kept asking him to be something no human could be." She spoke softly, like she was talking to him again. "You gave them everything, didn't you? Every ounce of light you had, and when there was nothing left, they wanted more." The interviewer didn't interrupt. There was nothing to add. Then came the line that would echo in every article written about her afterward. "I wasn't his prisoner," she said, "but I was part of his loneliness. Maybe we all were." That confession cracked something open, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever looked at their marriage and thought they understood it. Behind the glamour, the music, the legend, was a man terrified of fading, and a woman torn between saving him and saving herself. She took another breath, slower now, and her voice lowered. "People think silence protects you. It doesn't. It just eats you from the inside. I stayed silent for years because I thought the truth would destroy what little was left of him. But it wasn't truth that destroyed Elvis, it was pretending." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a tissue. Not out of weakness, but release. "I spent my life carrying his story like it was my cross to bear," she said, "and I think maybe that's what love does when it outlives the person. It becomes a weight you can't set down." She looked away, blinking back a tear, then smiled faintly. "But I still talk to him, you know. I still ask him if he found peace. Some nights I think I hear him laugh. Maybe that's his way of saying, 'It's all right, Scylla, you can tell them now.'" The interviewer asked one last question, hesitant, almost afraid to ruin the moment. "What do you want people to know about him, now that you've told the truth?" She thought for a long while, then. That he tried, God, he tried so hard, to love right, to stay right, to be what everyone wanted. But fame is a thief. It doesn't just take your time or your privacy, it takes the version of yourself you like the most. Her voice grew quiet, trembling just above a whisper. "And I think that's why he kept loving people who reminded him of who he was before it all." She paused. "Maybe that's why he loved me." When she finished speaking, the recorder clicked off. But her words lingered. The truth she'd hidden for 50 years wasn't scandal or betrayal. It was the confession that Elvis Presley, the man the world worshipped, was never free. And neither was she. As she stood to leave, the afternoon light caught her face. She didn't look broken. She looked lighter, as if finally, after decades of carrying the myth, she had laid it down. "I wasn't ready to say it before," she whispered to herself, "but now I think he'd want me to." And just before walking away, she turned back with a faint smile. Maybe that's the only truth worth telling, that even kings can be lost, and the people who loved them are still trying to bring them home. The morning after that interview, Priscilla said she woke up feeling like she'd opened a door she couldn't close again. But the truth, once spoken, doesn't go quietly back to sleep. It starts to pull at memories you thought had already healed. She sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at an old photograph of Graceland. People saw a mansion, she saw a stage, one that never dimmed even after the curtains fell. "Behind those velvet curtains," she said softly, "wasn't a fairy tale. It was a war between who he was and who they wanted him to be." When she first moved into Graceland, she was barely out of high school. She thought she was walking into a love story, the kind that songs were written about. But the house itself had a heartbeat, thick with voices, footsteps, laughter that never seemed to stop. The men who filled the halls, the Memphis Mafia, weren't just friends, they were witnesses. Every joke, every argument, every whispered conversation between her and Elvis seemed to echo through them before it reached the outside world. "I remember the first night I stayed there," she said. "I couldn't sleep. The phone rang every hour, women calling, saying he'd promised to see them, some crying, some angry. I'd hang up and pretend it didn't hurt." At first, she believed it was just the price of being with him. You couldn't love Elvis Presley and expect quiet. But quiet was all she wanted. One night in 1963, she heard him on the phone in the next room. His voice was soft, familiar, the kind of voice he used when he didn't want to be heard. When she walked in, he hung up fast, smiled, said it was just business. She nodded, pretending to believe him. But later, when she checked the table by the phone, she saw a letter creased, folded twice. The handwriting wasn't his. "I never told anyone," she said. "I just read the first line. You said you'd call when she was asleep." She folded it back and put it exactly where it had been. That was the first time she realized that being Mrs. Presley meant living between illusion and truth. But it wasn't all betrayal. That was what made it harder. Because for every secret that broke her heart, there were moments that made her forgive everything. He could be so gentle it was disarming. He'd come into her room at midnight, carrying his guitar, sit at the edge of the bed, and hum half a song he'd written for her. Sometimes he'd stop mid-verse, look at her, and whisper, "You keep me from drowning, you know that." She wanted to believe it. And maybe, in his own way, he meant it. But even as he said it, she could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. The weight of 1,000 expectations pressing down on a single man. "I was holding onto someone who was holding onto the world," she said, "and you can't compete with that." The longer she stayed, the more the house felt like it belonged to everyone but her. Every friend who came through the gates wanted a piece of him. Every producer, every reporter, every woman who called at 2 a.m. And Elvis, always trying to please them all, would just laugh it off. "They don't mean anything, baby," he'd say. "You're the one I come home to." She'd smile, but something inside her kept shrinking. Love wasn't supposed to feel like waiting your turn. She remembered one afternoon, the sun pouring through the curtains, the house unusually still. Elvis had gone upstairs for a nap. She walked into the den and saw a stack of photographs on the table. Publicity, stills from Viva Las Vegas. Elvis and Anne Margaret laughing, dancing, holding hands in a way that didn't look staged. She froze. The world was already whispering about them, but seeing it, seeing the chemistry frozen in film, cut deeper than any headline. She asked him about it that night. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "Honey, the camera loves a good story. Don't let it fool you." But she could tell, by the way he avoided her eyes, that it wasn't just the camera that was in love. The following week, she found another envelope. Inside was a clipping from a magazine, Elvis wins love of Anne Margaret, and a short note written in her mother's handwriting. "Sweetheart, come home if you need to." Priscilla said that was the first time she thought about leaving. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she was afraid of losing herself completely inside his shadow. But when she confronted him, voice trembling, heart pounding, he didn't get angry. He looked wounded, like a child caught between guilt and pride. "You think I'd ever leave you," he said softly. "You're my life, Scylla, you're my peace." And just like that, she stayed. Because when Elvis said those words, you wanted to believe them. They were music. They made the lies sound like lullabies. Years later, she would admit that Graceland had two worlds, the one the cameras saw and the one behind closed doors. In public, they were perfect. In private, she was constantly bracing for the next heartbreak. Elvis lived in extremes, she said. He could make you feel like the center of his universe one day and invisible the next. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. He didn't know how to exist in the middle. There were nights when he'd come home from the studio, eyes glassy, body trembling from the pills. He'd talk about destiny, about God, about how fame was a punishment and a blessing all at once. She'd sit there, listening, afraid to interrupt. Because she knew if she said the wrong thing, he'd retreat again, vanish into that unreachable part of himself. But for all the pain, she couldn't bring herself to hate him. "I think I pitied him more than anything," she said. "He was trapped by a crown he couldn't take off. Everyone called him king, but he didn't have any power, not really. He was owned by what people expected him to be." Sometimes she'd catch him staring out the window, hours before dawn, just watching the front gates. Fans would still be there, waiting in the dark, hopping for a glimpse. And she'd see the smallest smile cross his face, a smile that said they still care. Then, almost instantly, it would fade. She knew that look too well. It was the look of a man haunted by how quickly love could turn into memory. There was another night, years later, that still haunted her. They'd just returned from Los Angeles. He was tired, moody, distant. She found him sitting alone in the den, a stack of unopened letters beside him. When she asked if he was all right, he said quietly, "You know, Scylla, the worst part of being loved by millions is realizing none of them really know you." She sat beside him, unsure what to say. He picked up one of the letters, opened it, and read aloud. "I named my baby Elvis. You changed my life." Then he put it down and said, "They think I saved them, but they're the ones keeping me alive." She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't hold it either. "He was there," she said, "but he was." For years, she tried to build a home around a man who didn't belong anywhere. Even when they laughed, when they danced in the living room or shared breakfast at dawn, she could feel it slipping. Like every joy came with an invisible timer. "People talk about the drugs, the women, the fame," she said, "but the real addiction was attention. He couldn't breathe without it, and the moment he didn't have it, he fell apart." That need wasn't vanity, it was fear. Fear that if he stopped shining, everyone would realize how broken he was underneath the glow. When she spoke about those years, her tone wasn't bitter. It was quiet, reflective, the kind of sorrow that had already burned itself out. She described how she used to walk the hallways of Graceland late at night, barefoot, listening for him. Sometimes she'd hear him playing gospel music alone in the den, his voice softer, more human than anyone had ever heard it on stage. That was the version of him she missed most. He'd close his eyes and sing like he was begging heaven to let him start over, she said. But when the song ended, the silence would come back, and so would the distance. The interviewer asked her once if she ever felt jealous of the other women. She shook her head. "Not jealous," she said, "just sad, because I knew they weren't getting him either. They were getting the dream of him, and dreams can't hold you." She paused. The real Elvis wasn't in the spotlight. He was in the small things, the way he'd hum when he made coffee, the way he'd kiss the horses on the nose, the way he'd leave little notes that said "Don't forget me" even when I was in the next room. That's the part she couldn't explain to people, the contradiction of it all. How one man could make you feel worshipped and abandoned in the same breath. By 1966, the tension in the house had turned heavy. Even the air felt rehearsed. He'd started talking about marriage, mostly because he sensed it was expected. She loved him, but she also knew he was trying to fix something that couldn't be repaired with vows. "I think he believed marriage would calm the noise," she said. "He didn't realize it would only make the silence louder." Still, when he proposed, right before Christmas, she said yes. Not because she was ready, but because she couldn't bear to be the one who said no. He told her, "We'll start fresh, baby. No more rumors, no more lies, just us." And for a while, she believed him. Because every broken heart still wants one more try. On the morning of their wedding, she remembered looking at him in his tuxedo, smiling like a boy, nervous as if it were his first show. He whispered, "You still love me, don't you?" She nodded. He smiled back, but there was fear in his eyes. That fear followed them everywhere. Through the honeymoon, through the photographs, through every public smile. He wanted so badly to be the version of himself that people loved, handsome, charming, invincible. But in private, she could see the cracks. Elvis didn't know how to be loved quietly, she said. It had to be grand, loud, eternal. Anything less felt like losing. By the time she finished telling the story, her voice had gone soft, almost prayer-like. "There were moments I thought he'd finally found peace. He'd sit beside me, take my hand and say, 'You're my home, Scylla.' And I'd think, maybe this time it's real." But peace never stayed long in that house. It came and went like music on the wind. She leaned back, eyes heavy with memory. "I used to blame the fame, the drugs, the women, but I think it was simpler than that. He was afraid of love, because love meant someone could leave, and he'd already lost too much." The interviewer didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After a long silence, she added one last thought. "People think I was the one trapped at Graceland, but maybe it was him. He built those gates to keep the world out. He just didn't realize he locked himself in." The story of Elvis and Priscilla's early years wasn't just about passion or fame. It was about two people learning that love can't survive when it's surrounded by noise. Behind the velvet curtains, there wasn't glamour. There was longing. There was fear. There was a man who couldn't stop chasing the version of himself he thought people wanted, and a woman who kept waiting for the man she fell in love with in Germany to come back. And as she said those words, her voice grew quiet again. "I kept telling myself he'd come home," she said, "but you can't come home when you do know where you belong." She said it started one night in 1972, after a concert in Las Vegas. The room was still filled with the echo of applause, but Elvis was quiet, too quiet. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed, his eyes hollow, his voice small. When Priscilla walked in, he didn't look up. He just said, "You ever feel like you're playing a man that doesn't exist anymore?" That question cut straight through her. Because that was the moment she realized the truth. Elvis Presley wasn't fighting his fans, or fame, or even his demons. He was fighting himself. For years she'd seen glimpses of that war, behind the smiles, the flashbulbs, the carefully rehearsed charm. But now the mask had slipped. He wasn't the king of rock and roll sitting there. He was a man terrified that the world had already moved on without him. "I think that was when he started to break," she said softly. not because people stopped loving him, but because he stopped believing he was worth being loved. Priscilla had learned to read his moods like weather patterns. She could sense a storm before it came. When the tension grew too heavy, when the pills dulled his eyes, she knew another confession was coming, half truth, half cry for help. Sometimes he'd talk about the army days, or his mother, or the promise he'd made to God that he never kept. Other times he'd just pace the floor, mumbling song lyrics that didn't exist. But that night in Vegas was different. He looked at her like a man who had nothing left to hide. "I'm tired of pretending," he said. "Every night they want the same thing, hound dog, the moves, the smile. But I'm not that man anymore, Scylla. I don't even remember who he was." She tried to comfort him, told him he didn't have to prove anything anymore, that people still adored him. He just shook his head. "They adore an idea," he said, "and ideas don't blade." That confession marked a shift in their marriage, one that neither of them could stop. Priscilla said she began to see his loneliness not as cruelty, but as a kind of sickness. He didn't cheat because he wanted more women, she explained. He cheated because he wanted to feel something, to feel real again. Each new affair didn't replace her, it numbed him. It was less about desire and more about escape. He'd come home looking guilty, apologetic, promising to do better. But the apology always came with that same hollow stare. Like a man who had already forgiven himself because he knew he couldn't change. He used to say, "Don't hate me for being weak," she whispered, and I'd tell him, "I don't hate you, I just miss you." Elvis had built his entire life on performance. Every gesture, every word, every smile was part of the show. But when the lights went out, he didn't know how to live without the audience. The pills started early, uppers to get on stage, downers to get some sleep, and something in between to keep the rhythm steady. He thought he could control it, she said, but what he didn't realize was that the control was already gone. Priscilla remembered one particular morning. He hadn't slept in 2 days, packing from room to room, convinced someone was following him. She tried to calm him, but he snapped, eyes wild, voice shaking. "You think you know me," he shouted. "You don't know me, nobody does." Then, just as suddenly, his face softened. He looked at her like a lost child. "I'm sorry, baby," he whispered. "I just get scared sometimes." She wanted to hold him, to take that fear away, but she couldn't. He was trapped inside a version of himself that had outlived the man who created it. "People see the fame," she said, "but they don't see what it does to your soul when every part of your life becomes a performance." He was on stage, even at the dinner table. Sometimes he'd slip into character even with her, laughing too loud, talking like he was giving an interview. She'd watch him switch between selves and wonder which one was real. One night, when the cameras were gone, he turned to her and said, "You know, sometimes I feel like I'm watching my own life from the audience, and I keep wondering when the show will end." That sentence broke her more than any affair ever could, because she knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about music. He was talking about the exhaustion of being Elvis Presley. As the years went on, she noticed something darker creeping in. The music that used to bring him joy now made him anxious. He'd listened to old recordings of his early days, the raw, young voice that made the world fall in love, and shake his head. "That kid had no idea what was coming," he'd say. There was a deep sadness in him, the kind that didn't come from loss alone. It came from knowing you become everything you swore you'd never be. "I think he started to resent the very thing that made him famous," Priscilla said. "He felt trapped by his own success. And in that resentment, something inside him fractured. He pushed away the people who tried to help. Doctors, friends, even family. Because accepting help meant admitting he wasn't invincible, and Elvis Presley couldn't be seen as weak." She told the interviewer about a night just before she left him. They were in their bedroom at Graceland. He was quiet again, sitting by the window, staring at the dark. She asked what he was thinking. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "You ever love something so much that you start to hate it because you know it's killing you?" She didn't know what to say. He turned to her and smiled sadly. "That's what the stage feels like now." It wasn't anger in his voice, it was sorrow. A kind of grief for the man he used to be. That was the moment she knew he wasn't coming back from whatever place he was trapped in. Still, part of her couldn't give up on him. She tried to get him help, begged him to slow down, to take a break from touring. But every time she brought it up, he'd look at her with that same haunted expression. "If I stop, I disappear," he'd say. "You don't get it, Scylla. The second I stop, they'll forget me." Those words became his curse. He kept performing, kept burning himself out, terrified of fading from the spotlight. And the more he tried to hold onto it, the more it slipped through his hands. He was like a candle trying to outshine the sun, she said. He didn't know he was already enough. When she finally decided to leave, it wasn't out of anger, it was mercy. For both of them. "I couldn't save him," she said, "and staying would have only meant losing myself." Before she walked out that last morning, he stopped her. He didn't yell, he didn't beg. He just said, "Promise me you'll remember the real me, the one before all this." She looked at him, tears in her eyes. "Who was that, Elvis?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I don't know anymore, but maybe you do." She said that moment haunted her for decades. Because even then, after everything, she still saw flashes of the boy she'd met in Germany. The one who played songs just for her. The one who laughed with his whole heart. The one who wanted love more than applause. "I think that's why I couldn't hate him," she said. "He wasn't cruel, he was lost, and you can't punish someone for being lost." After she left, they still talked. Phone calls late at night, check-ins about Lisa, small reminders that they hadn't stopped caring. But there was always distance in his voice, as if he were already fading into myth. During one of those last conversations, she asked him how he was feeling. He paused, then said, "Some days I feel like I'm already gone, Scylla, like I'm just visiting this life until it's time to go." She tried to joke it off, told him he was being dramatic. But deep down, she felt a chill. Because he meant it. He knew his time was running out, she said. I could hear it in the way he said goodbye. That was the hidden battle no one ever saw, the quiet surrender. Not to drugs or fame, but to the exhaustion of being everything to everyone. Priscilla said that's what she wanted people to understand. Elvis wasn't destroyed by fame alone. He was destroyed by love, by the desperate need to be loved so completely that he forgot how to love himself. People think he was arrogant, she said. He was terrified of being ordinary. Every new song, every performance, every crowd was his way of proving he still mattered. But each time he tried to fill that hole with applause, it only got deeper. I think he was looking for God in the crowd, she said quietly, and the tragedy is, he never realized God was already in him. She talked about the last time she saw him perform. His voice wasn't as strong, his body heavier, but there were moments when his eyes still shone the way they used to. He sang like a man reaching for redemption, like every lyric was a prayer. I remember thinking, he's not singing to us anymore, she said. He's singing to something bigger, maybe to find forgiveness. When he bowed that night, she saw the smallest smile cross his face. It wasn't for the audience, it was for himself. For a fleeting second, he looked peaceful. Months later, when she got the call that he was gone, her first thought wasn't disbelief, it was heartbreak mixed with relief. Relief that his pain was finally over. Relief that he was free from the endless noise. I don't think he feared death, she said. He feared being forgotten, and that's the one thing that never happened. For years, she stayed silent about the depth of his struggle. because she knew the world didn't want to see their hero broken. But as she grew older, she realized the truth wasn't betrayal, it was love. Love means telling the whole story, even when it hurts. At 75, when she looked back, she didn't see scandal or tragedy. She saw a man who gave too much, and a woman who learned too late that you can't save someone who doesn't want saving. But she also saw grace in that brokenness. Because beneath all the chaos and fame and heartbreak, Elvis was still just a boy from Tupelo who wanted to be loved for who he really was. He used to say, "Scylla, one day they'll know the real me," she said. "Maybe this is that day." And with that she smiled, a quiet, bittersweet smile that carried both forgiveness and truth. "People keep asking me if I still love him," she said. "I tell them, love like that doesn't stop, it just changes shape, it turns into understanding." She paused, then added one last line. "He wasn't perfect, but he was human, and that's what makes his story worth telling." The morning of August 18th, 1977, was unnaturally still. The world had stopped spinning, or at least that's how it felt when the call came. Elvis Presley, gone. To everyone else, it was history. To Priscilla, it was unfinished business. She said she didn't cry right away. There was too much disbelief in the air, too many people trying to control what grief was supposed to look like. But when she walked into Graceland later that day, everything inside her cracked. The house that had once been filled with noise, laughter, music, it was silent. Every echo of him lingered in the walls, but the man himself was nowhere. "They kept saying, 'The king is dead,'" she remembered. "But to me, it wasn't a king. It was the boy who used to sing me lullabies in the middle of the night." The days that followed blurred together. Reporters, crowds, mourning fans pressed against the gates. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, a quote, a glimpse of her pain. But she didn't speak, not to the cameras, not to the world. "I made a promise," she said quietly, "the last one I ever made to him." It happened at the funeral, just before they closed the casket. She'd placed her hand on his chest, cold now, still, and whispered something only he would understand. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't goodbye. It was a vow. "I told him I'd protect his truth," she said, "even if it meant they'd hate me for it." And for decades, she kept that vow. She shielded the image, the legend, the fragile dignity he couldn't defend for himself. She fought through lawsuits, interviews, and accusations that she was profiting off his name. Every time someone called her manipulative or controlling, she'd remind herself, "You promised." But promises made in grief have a way of turning into cages. Years passed, and every silence she held became heavier. The books, the documentaries, the rumors, everyone had their version of Elvis except her. "I used to think staying quiet was loyalty," she said, "but the truth is, silence can become its own kind of lie." She remembered sitting alone one night, years after his death, watching old footage of him on stage. He was singing Unchained Melody. Sweat dripping, voice trembling, body frail, but eyes still burning with something unbreakable. She realized then that the promise she made wasn't to hide him, it was to preserve the part of him the world never saw. The man behind the myths. For years, people had asked why she never remarried. She'd always give polite answers, "My focus was on Lisa," or "It just never felt right." But the truth was simpler. You don't replace the kind of love that defined you. You just learn to live inside its shadow. "I think I loved him more after he died," she admitted, "because death stripped away everything that got in the way, the fame, the mistakes, the noise. What was left was just him." There were nights she'd dream about him walking through the door again, young, healthy, laughing that deep southern laugh that filled the room. And she'd wake up angry at herself for still missing him after all these years. But grief doesn't run on time, it just changes shape. Her silence finally began to crack when Lisa grew older. She said her daughter once asked, "Mom, what was he really like when nobody was watching?" And Priscilla didn't know how to answer. How do you explain a man who could be a storm one minute and a prayer the next? How do you summarize someone who loved the world but never learned to love himself? I realized then, she said, that if I kept hiding the truth, my own daughter would never know her father beyond the legend. So she started talking. Not to defend, not to glorify, but to humanize. She told Lisa about his tenderness, his humor, the way he'd sing nonsense songs to make her laugh. She told her about his fears too, the loneliness, the insecurity, the desperation that came with being idolized by millions but understood by none. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way to honor the man, not the monument. In time, she learned that truth doesn't tarnish love, it refines it. Because love built on myth can't survive. But love built on truth, even painful truth, endures. She said she used to visit Graceland at night, long after the tour ended. She'd stand in the quiet halls, tracing her hand over the banisters, listening for echoes of their laughter. Sometimes she swore she could feel him there, not as a ghost, but as memory finally at peace. One night, she walked into his old music room. The piano was still there, untouched. She sat down and pressed a single key. It rang out, low and mournful, and she whispered into the stillness, "I kept my promise, but I think it's time I let you go." Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting that love could exist without ownership, that devotion could outlast control. She finally understood what she hadn't back then, that Elvis didn't belong to her, or to the fans, or to the world. He belonged to the truth of who he was, and that truth was complicated. He was generous and stubborn, spiritual and reckless, a dreamer who couldn't wake up from the dream he created. But he was real, and maybe that was enough. Over the years, she found herself defending him less and remembering him more. The sharp edges of their past softened into lessons. She saw the irony now, that the girl who once tried to save him ended up being saved by what he left behind. "Elvis taught me something no one else could," she said. "That love isn't about possession or perfection. It's about seeing someone's flaws and staying long enough to understand them." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "That's what I did. That's what I'll always do." In her later years, people began asking her to speak again, to share her memories, to tell the story from her side. And each time she approached it not as a confession, but as closure. "I used to think truth and love couldn't coexist," she said, "but now I know they're the same thing. You can't love someone if you're afraid of their truth." She started to share the parts she once protected, the late-night fears, the handwritten apologies, the moments when he'd look at her and say, "Don't let them turn me into something I'm not." She kept that promise. By revealing the man behind the myth, she gave him something the world never did, the dignity of being human. When asked what she would say to him if she could see him one last time, she didn't hesitate. "I'd tell him I'm proud of him," she said, "not for being Elvis Presley, the world already did that, but for being brave enough to live the way he did, even when it broke him." She paused, her voice softening. "And I'd tell him I kept his secrets as long as I could. But it's time the world knew who he really was, not the image, but the man who just wanted to be loved." At 75, she stood on a quiet stage at Graceland during an anniversary event. Fans from around the world had gathered, candles flickering, eyes full of devotion. When she spoke, her tone was gentle, but it carried decades of weight. "You've all loved him for so long," she said, "and I thank you, but love isn't worship. Love is truth, so if you really want to honor him, remember the man, not just the music." The crowd fell silent, the kind of silence that comes from understanding. Because for the first time, she wasn't protecting his image. She was setting him free. She often says she still talks to him, though not out loud. When the world feels heavy, when she looks back on all the years between then and now, she closes her eyes and hears his voice. Sometimes it's teasing, sometimes it's kind, and sometimes it's quiet. He once told me love was the only thing that ever made sense to him, she said. Maybe that's why his story still matters, because love, real love, doesn't end when someone leaves, it just changes form. She smiled, and I think that's what he wanted me to understand all along. When she finished her final interview, she looked calm. There was no sadness in her eyes, only gratitude. After half a century of silence, the promise had finally been kept. Not by hiding him, but by revealing him. She said, for the first time since that day in August, I think he can rest, and maybe now so can I. Because some promises aren't meant to last forever, they're meant to guide us back to honesty. For 50 years, Priscilla Presley carried the weight of a legend and the silence of a love that outlived its story. Now she's giving that story back to the world, not to protect his image, but to show his heart. Behind the rhinestones, the spotlight, and the myth was a man who feared being forgotten, and a woman who refused to let him vanish. And maybe that's the truth she guarded all along. That love doesn't need to be perfect to be eternal. It just needs to be remembered with mercy. Because in the end, the only legacy worth leaving isn't the fame or the fortune or even the legend. It's the people brave enough to tell the truth when silence would have been easier.